Well, not everybody misses me, so. Yeah. And I know that I know that food. Her little hateful self out. Like, Mom, really? I love it.
You're gonna say that anyway.
No, I wouldn't. I would have said it. I would have said it without sharing here.
I keep asking her.
They ask me almost daily. You still like it? You still want to do it? Yes.
Still keep showing up.
Yep.
That our doing the share. Really good. Real good.
Good.
Yeah. Making a lot of changes. That's for the good.
Yeah, yeah. As we
Health
get
wise.
older,
Yeah.
as we get older,
Yeah.
gotta make
Absolutely. How about yourself?
getting older.
That's a blessing though.
Yeah, still there.
Yeah.
Left yet. Ready to go.
How long has it been?
17.
Oh my God.
Almost next month will be 17 years.
How long you been quitting?
27.
When's your turn
Oh,
on?
27?
Yeah. Well, if you want to go out with the pool,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I probably could give it 25. 25.
Oh yeah, you're taking all that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But it's like, I can't. It's just, hard. It's everybody, though.
You know, anywhere and everywhere you go.
Yeah,
That's a lot to do.
definitely. Oh my gosh. Yep. Yeah.
I gave your copy to Diane. Probably don't.
Good afternoon, you all. Thanks so much for being here. We're going to go ahead and get this meeting started, and we'll begin with a roll call. And do make sure you turn off your mic when you're not doing it. It's got the little red button.
All right, thank you, Diane. And that's a good place for me to give just a reminder that if you are speaking at any time, we do ask that you would press the right side button with the little person with the sound waves coming out if you're going to speak, so that it can be recorded for our meeting minutes. Also, if anybody is going to make public comment either for items on the agenda or for items not on the agenda, you can use a microphone if one is available to you, and if there's not one at your seat, you can also go to the podium. We have a microphone there. So starting with the roll call, Kathy Ploman. Joy Andrade.
Here.
Alicia Branham is excused. Janice James.
Here.
Liz Sheehan.
Here.
Chris Clark. Bo Revlett is excused. New board member who I'll introduce to you following roll call, Billy Love.
Here.
Lola Still.
Here.
Bruce Davis.
Here.
Amanda Bryant.
Here.
Diane Fleet.
Here.
And TC Johnson is getting signed in, so she is here. Like I said, we do have a new board member with us. I want to make sure I introduce you all to Billy Love. She is a licensed clinical social worker with LifeStance Healthcare. She has a background focusing on trauma. She also is a member of BUILD, a veteran, and an individual with some lived experience herself. So we're really glad to have her, all of the experience, expertise, and insight that she brings to our board. So thank you very much for joining us.
You all should have received in your packet the minutes from last meeting. So if you could take a second and just do a little double check, and then we'll take a motion to approve or any recommendations of corrections. So take a few minutes. Did anybody see any corrections or have any comments about the minutes? Have you had enough time to review? All right, then I will take a motion to approve the minutes. Thank you, Joy. A second?
I'll second that.
Second.
Thank you. Multiple seconds. All those in favor say aye. Any abstentions? Any of those who do not approve? Nay? All right.
All right, and also just going to state for the record that Kathy Ploman is with us. Caught you earlier.
Next on our agenda is public and partner comments for issues on the agenda. It's very quiet. Should we move on to data systems? If you all have something later on, we'll go back to that. But next, we're going to move to Data and Systems Integration Committee report with Joy.
All right, can you hear me? Okay, thank you so much. So I'll say Marissa kindly took notes on the April 3rd meeting that was held at the East Side Lexington Public Library branch. It was called to order at 1:33. The first item on the agenda was to approve the meeting February 7th meeting minutes. It passed without any comments or change requests. The first item of new business was that Jeff discussed the 2024 Lex Count results. And those results were submitted to HUD at the end of April 2024. So several things to kind of consider before jumping into some of those results. So in 2021, we had an exception and did not conduct the count due to COVID. And in 2022, we had a slight variance where we conducted the full count, but it was conducted later in the year in February due to the high rates of COVID at the time. So what we found this year was that we had a nominal increase. So last year there were 815 persons identified, and this year there were 825, only a 1.2% increase. Some significant findings were that while we had a 6% increase in seasonal beds available, there was actually a 2% decrease in persons that actually accessed these beds. So this kind of reinforced the discussion that we've had in the past about needing to address high barrier shelters and then having shelters that can accommodate couples without minors, pets, and service animals. To further support that point, we did see that in 2023, there were only 38 individuals experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And then this year in 2024, there were 82 persons identified who were experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And that likely is again due to the fact that many of them were couples and were unable to be accommodated by shelters. And within the different types of households that we saw, within 2024, there was a decrease in single adults and an increase in families, which was actually a reversal of what we saw in 2023. And then we did see a decrease in self-reported chronic homelessness by 22% from 2023. So on the night of our count, we saw that only 15% of individuals reported being chronically homeless. And it's also important to note that the national average of chronic homelessness is around 30%. And then of those who were unsheltered, 50% of them reported being first-time homelessness. And then in terms of youth, we saw that our numbers were still relatively low. In 2024, of the 825 counted, 6.7% fell between the ages of 18 and 24. And then there was a motion to approve the results of the 2024 Lex count, which passed unanimously. There was no further discussion or questions. All right, and then the last item of the agenda was that Marissa covered the fiscal year 23 HUD system performance measures. And it's also kind of important to note that these system performance measures, give us a great snapshot of the whole year, while the Lex count provided just kind of a single night kind of snapshot. So we saw that measure 1, there was a decrease in the numbers within our COC system. However, an increase in the number of days people experience homelessness. Within measure 2, the system at large saw an increase of 3% from 18% in 2022 to 21% in 2023. However, it was stated that the reason for the increase was the increase of those who had returned to homelessness within 6 months. And then there was a decrease of those exiting from street outreach, however, an increase in positive exits. And then lastly, there was an increase of success rate of those who exited or remained in permanent supportive housing. And then once open for public comment, there were no public comments. And then the meeting was adjourned. The next meeting will be June 5th at the East Side Lexington Public Library branch, and it will take place at 1:30. Thank you.
So we will need to do at some point an approval of the Lex count results, and that will require a second from the board, the motion coming from committee. Many of you have already seen this material as it went through committee, but I did want to kind of open the floor to see if there was any additional questions or discussion prior to approval. I think Joy covered a lot of ground. While you think about if you have any questions, I'll just mention, obviously we saw a significant increase in the number of persons that were experiencing unsheltered homelessness. About 50% of those were parts of multi-person households. So that's consistent with the fact that we currently lack a shelter that can accommodate couples without minor children. And about 50% of those unsheltered also reported being first-time homeless. So that would coincide with, for example, potentially not being familiar with all of the resources that are in the area, how to access shelter or other resources. Some of the trends that we see, like around chronic homelessness, we have to understand some limitations on year-to-year comparisons. Overall, longitudinally, we're seeing that rate being somewhat consistent. I think, for example, our unsheltered data shows that this year we had some persons experiencing unsheltered homelessness that were first-time homeless, kind of contributes to us seeing that decline in chronic homelessness. Veteran homelessness was down slightly, consistent with our usage designation for having effectively ended veteran homelessness. And as was pointed out by Joy, we had additional shelter beds over the season, but fewer persons that access shelter, again, consistent with what we saw in terms of the increase in unsheltered homelessness. But again, glad to speak to any further questions or discussion.
I just have a little bit of a question, because one of the things too is also talking about the increase of youth. And so I know it's something TC's been working with a lot about, and I'd be curious also with Arbor Youth, with Christy, like, are you seeing, I just kind of want to get a little bit of what your idea is around why we're seeing an increase with kids and youth.
Well, one is on our end, especially as it deals with the Lex count, is there's different definitions of homelessness. So under the McKinney-Vento law, there's a different definition. But our homeless population among our students from preschool to 12th grade has increased tremendously. Last year's numbers, it had went up 12%. This year numbers, it'll probably be a greater. Currently, we're at about 1,075 of students, but there are multiple reasons why our families are experiencing homelessness. Evictions are now increasing, the cost of unaffordable housing, unemployment, condemnation, fires. We've had several fires that have had multiple children in those homes. So it's a multiple reasons why that our families are experiencing homelessness.
I think this is talking about 18 to 24, but I'd be really curious what you're thinking too of under that age as well.
Under that age, I know we're seeing an increase, I think, because, well, we're starting to take more kids out of shelter, so the numbers are going up. So, we're having a lot more families who notice, where we're having to split the mom and the kids up, or the 18 to 24-year-old mom. Shelter, and then the kid would be at our, those numbers are increasing, so it's on both sides.
Thanks.
Okay, let me also add to that too, to our numbers, is that particularly in the last couple of months, we've also seen an increase in our undocumented families as far as children are concerned. So that's another area that we're challenged with.
I was gonna mention the undocumented families also, just in school. You know, not through the Hope Center, but through friends and a church group. That the church group, they deliver meals to families, and I know I've been approached about a family whose parent was sent back to the country that they came from, but there was a high school student that was 17 that stayed in the home, at least for that time, but didn't have money to eat or anything, and was still in school. And I don't know if that sort of thing is getting reported. I think for a while I thought that the Latino community had grown so much in a positive way in the city that they were sort of caring for, you know, sort of left the shelters and went into the community. But I think that was an overly optimistic view on my part, and it worries me that there are more undocumented kids in school that are homeless or almost homeless.
And I'll add just a couple of things from the perspective of my office. One would be piggybacking off something that TC said about, you know, evictions increasing at the moment. So obviously we had for a time the housing stabilization program with federal emergency rental assistance funds. And unfortunately, we have exhausted our community's funding, and so we no longer have the wide-scale prevention funding that we had available for a few years in our community. Now, LFUCG has partnered with Fayette County Public Schools and Goodwill to do a program that targets providing assistance to McKinney-Vento households. But the scope of that program is going to be much smaller than what housing stabilization could support. So we are seeing, just a significant temporary resource no longer in our community. Another thing, just anecdotally, that we've heard a lot of and calls for assistance to our office has been things like persons that are temporarily staying with others. A lot of landlords seem to be enforcing tenancy a lot more and issuing lease violations if there might be persons who are temporarily doubled up or staying with friends and family while they're seeking subsequent housing. So I think that may also be a potential factor. Just a reminder, if there's no additional discussion or questions, that we would need a second for this item. All right, TC gave a second. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion passes.
On to the next. All right. So our next committee report is Liz Sheehan, Program Performance and Evaluation Committee Report.
Thank you. We met on April 17th at 1:30 at the Eastside Library as well. We started with welcome and introductions, and then the approval of our meeting minutes from the February 21st, 2024 meeting. Those were approved at that time. And then we had our program reviews. So the first one we had was Community Action Council for the Crisis and Housing Support for Youth Rapid Rehousing Program. Each program presents all of their data and performance metrics, but our discussions centered around the exits to permanent housing being under the targeted amount. So we discussed some of the reasons for that. We also discussed challenges and measurement of earned income for that program. Our next presentation was for the Project Independence Rapid Rehousing Program. Some of the discussion for this particular program was around the factors related to lower permanent housing numbers. So what the challenges were, are there things that we would be able to address within our system, and then the calculation of the length of time in the program using an average versus a median, or whether there were outliers in that data. And then Greenhouse 17 presented on the emergency shelter program, and some of the discussion for that was, again, the calculation of length of stay, maybe moving towards presenting a median as well as an average. And then we talked about recidivism rate and how it might be challenging to know if a past client goes to another domestic violence shelter, or kind of tracking people through different programs, primarily because of confidentiality standards being so high, to be able to know if someone went to a different program after leaving theirs. And then we had discussion around the safety planning that they do with their clients. Then the last presentation was the New Vista Continuum of Care Permanent Supportive Housing Program. Some of the discussion around this program, well, most of the discussion was actually around the supportive employment work that they do. So they have a particular employment specialist that has really worked hard to engage with employers and to build those relationships to get clients placed. And then another discussion point was working on landlord relationships for the housing component and housing stability piece. We had a few just kind of general announcements at the end of the meeting and then adjourned. Our next meeting will be on June 12th at 1:30. This actually is a week earlier than typical, so if you're looking at your calendar, just mark that. We typically would meet on June 19th, but that is Juneteenth, so it's an LFUCG holiday. And we'll meet at the East Side Library branches. Thank you.
Need a vote or anything on that, right? All right, does anybody have any questions at all for Liz or just to bring up about that committee report? All right, so the next, the next committee is Advocacy Issues and Programs Committee, and Bo's not here, so Jeff, are you?
Yep. I unfortunately didn't know until this week that Bo was going to be unable to attend. He's facilitating a training in Chicago, so well wishes to him. We actually had elected for our last advocacy committee meeting to hold an open house style meeting. That was an attempt to try to invite additional organizations and new persons to join the continuum. We did a review of what the continuum of care is, the work that goes on in each of our committees to help individuals and organizations understand if they do want to join into our work, what committees might be most valuable to them or might be a good fit. We also did some discussion of COC strategies, including strategies to reduce the length of time that persons experience homelessness, preventing returns to homelessness, increasing exits to permanent housing, and increasing income, both employment and non-employment income. We did see both some new faces as well as some organizations who are formal members but are not necessarily active at all of our meetings. So I think it was successful in bringing some clarity and a little bit of just easy to stand, accessible information to people around the work that we do, and we're hoping to continue that trend at least annually, holding that kind of a format. So definitely thank you to anyone who shared that information and got more individuals to come and learn about the continuum of care. Additionally, we gave an update on the program standards review calendar. The next meeting for that is going to be a review of emergency shelter standards, and that is scheduled for Wednesday, May 22nd, and that's going to be here in the Phoenix building in the first floor conference room. Providers should have already received the current version of those standards in advance so that we can bring to the discussion any needs that we need to update or change, anything that we would want to take a look at. Again, the intent of that review is just to make sure that on a regular basis we're reviewing to ensure that standards match what we do in practice, and that if there are any changes that we're updating routinely. That was it for this month's advocacy meeting. We will meet next on June 26th, and that will be at the Dawn Ball Campus Center.
Now the rest of the meeting is all you. Encampment, please.
So we'll start with the encampment review. A report should have went out in your packet. LFUCG performed only 2 encampment cleanups during the period since we last met. One of those involved an active encampment and one did not. So we'll start with the first location that was notified to the OHPI on February 23rd via code enforcement. And this is going to be a couple that we have had previous encampments that we have worked in the same area. So we attempted to give a longer length of time than our policies would set forth, because we were really hoping that we would be able to move their situation to permanent housing. Unfortunately, we continued to see, as you can see from the listing of different contacts and attempts, limited engagement. We did get some engagement on some limited services like accessing state IDs, assistance in recertifying Medicaid benefits, but they were largely unwilling to engage us in a housing plan. Ultimately, they elected to relocate voluntarily. An initial notice was posted on March 25th and a final notice posted on April 3rd. That was eventually removed on April 8th. at a cost of $6,250. The other cleanup that was performed in this period was not an active encampment. We still did multiple checks to ensure that there was nobody that was coming back to retrieve anything that was left behind there. And that was a nominal cost of $350 performed on March 22nd. As this was not an active encampment, we did not go through a formal notice process. And of course, numbers were reflected in the summary to bring us kind of up to date on the fiscal year totals. At present, we have done 23 cleanups on 17 unique locations in fiscal year 24 with an average cost of just over $2,000. Any questions on the encampment report?
Could you talk a little bit about why the ratio way was so expensive? Because the average is 2,000 and the other cleanup for that period was 350, so 6,000 seems really
Yeah, it was one of our more costly removals. So this actually involved two kind of spots that were very nearby that were performed under one cleanup. Essentially, the larger cost was that they had essentially built an entire structure. So there was electric that was being borrowed from somewhere and was connected to this. And just due to the extensive nature of that structure, combined with the things that we typically see, just general kind of trash and debris, it was a much more costly removal for this particular site. So this is going to be a side street that runs off of Reynolds Road. A portion of the property that was cleared was actually on state right-of-way closer to New Circle Road. And then the other portion of it was kind of behind Morning Point. And so we were able to clear all of it in one trip with the proximity. But it was still pretty significant. I would be curious to know all the specifics of that myself. I unfortunately don't have details as to whose electric that was actually accessed, but I think it involved a rather elaborate extension cord situation. Any other questions on this report? All right, I'll just kind of tag on to that. Obviously, we unfortunately are seeing that House Bill 5 is going to take effect in July, which will include provisions against persons camping in public or private spaces. My office is working very, very hard to engage a number of parties, internal and external, to really understand what that might mean for us and to develop additional resources and supports so that we can try to make sure that people are accessing services and moving towards permanent housing rather than incurring criminal offenses. So next, we'll move on to the director's report, and we'll start with an update on the budget. So at this time, we have closed out our fiscal year 22 funds, which had rolled on to ARPA funding. As you'll recall, we did have a balance that was savings from our racial equity analysis that was ultimately funneled into supporting the temporary winter shelter. No other projects remain open on fiscal year 22. On fiscal year 23, we still have a couple of programs that are in process. First, our payee program, they just submitted another invoice, so that will be getting close to ending operations soon. We're going to be transitioning that program into the payee program with community and resident services around the start of the fiscal year. We also still have in process our onboarding curriculum for frontline staff. We are very excited that that project is nearly ready for rollout. We're beginning user testing and expect that to be officially launched around summertime. And that curriculum is going to be a learning management system that provider agencies are going to be able to access to help offset their burdens to train new staff. We see a high rate of turnover for frontline staff in this work due to things like just compassion fatigue, typically lower rates of pay despite pretty challenging work. And oftentimes when folks leave agencies, institutional knowledge leaves with them. So this is something that will help to offset that and help bring new members up to speed and give new tools or even just a refresher to existing staff members. We then have just a little bit of funds remaining that was from our HMIS subsidy, which came in a little bit under projected cost. And so we're using that money, which is a nominal amount of $598, to go ahead and continue processing state IDs for individuals experiencing homelessness. We're currently sitting at a balance of about $489 of that remaining. Fiscal year 24, also still on ARPA funding. So we had kind of paused on issuing some RFPs until we understood all of the costs that we were going to have to facilitate a winter response. So right now, this information is probably going to change very soon. We have a couple of RFPs that are in process currently. We have a RFP for intensive case management services, which is going to go under contract very soon. That targets trying to provide some additional case management support to persons who are awaiting a housing resource that might have complex mental and physical health care needs. The ideal being that we can connect them with needed services, ensure that their homelessness is not necessarily something that causes further exacerbation of any conditions that they have, by making sure they have correct levels of care, and also continue to explore other pathways to permanent housing beyond just our coordinated entry system. I think a lot of times there's a misunderstanding in the community that case management is very readily available, but it can be a challenge when someone doesn't meet a certain subpopulation or happen to have an insurance provider that can provide that service. So this is something that helps us to expand that. And for example, if our shelters have somebody that's not appropriate for shelter, or that they're struggling to maintain in shelter, if street outreach has somebody that they really are kind of at their maximum caseload, they could potentially kind of funnel that off to. The other RFP that we're currently working on is for landlord engagement and recruitment. We've had a lot of discussions about the challenges in locating affordable housing, and even some discussions and review of data that show that length of time between enrollment and housing move-in has increased exponentially in the last 5 years. Essentially, when we have vouchers and rental assistance available, we still struggle to find units that are within values that those resources can cover, or landlords willing to participate in our programs. We had locally passed a local source of income discrimination ban, but then immediately the state then ruled that we were unable to do that at the local level. So short of having a measure like that, this will pursue other strategies like providing additional support to landlords on trying to understand the requirements of programs, completing paperwork, incentives for participation, additional support around things like damages, and hopefully that will be a strategy that will allow us to identify new landlords to participate in programs and help us to reduce the length of time that persons that have access to housing support remain in a homeless situation. So these numbers, again, will change very soon, but we, at the time of issuing this packet, had just over 100,000, about 120,000 in ARPA funds remaining for the year, and we had a significant balance that's going to shift significantly after we fund these RFPs. Any remaining funds for 24 will then go through a budget amendment to move to fiscal year 25. So between these funds and the funds that we receive in fiscal year 25, we're going to be using that to fund things like new programming, but also the added resources that we feel the community is going to need in response to House Bill 5. Also, since it was overseen by this office, was included the budget for the temporary winter shelter. They have expended all of the ARPA funding, short of a nominal balance there that was moved back into the ARPA contingency plan, and we're in the process of closing out the final invoicing through the end of project closeout cost. Any questions regarding the budget? All right. If not, then we're going to segue into an update on our winter response. We had done this each board meeting throughout the season to understand, for example, if any of our resources might need additional funding or if there was anything that we needed to identify additional solutions for. Now that we're through the winter season, I wanted to give the board and our membership an update as to exactly what these resources did for our community. So starting with both the largest investment and the largest overall shelter project that went online during the season was the temporary winter shelter that accommodated both adult men and women at the Hope Village. So we saw at a peak 221 persons accessed that shelter on a single night. The average being closer to 134 persons per night, and it served a total of 1,006 unique persons. I've included in this presentation some of the demographics. So primarily we saw that there was more men that accessed the shelter than women, but we still had about 30% of those accessing shelter identify as female. And less than 1%, or around 1%, had other gender identities. In terms of age, we saw the lowest numbers among those who are 18 to 24 and those that were 65 plus, largely due to the availability of other resources like Arbor's Transition Age Youth Shelter and our Bluegrass Care Navigators program for those that were senior and disabled. In terms of race, it was largely fairly consistent with our overall system data. About 67% of those accessing shelter were white and 23% identified as Black or African American. Around 6% identified as multiracial, and 2% identified as Hispanic. So one thing that's kind of interesting or of note here is we have had a change in HMIS data standards over the past year that went into effect in October. They expanded the racial categories that were available in our system. And as a result, we've seen some kind of changes in how people self-identify. For example, we have seen very few persons self-identifying as Hispanic in the past because it was considered a separate category of an ethnicity rather than a racial category. But now that it's being presented to individuals as one of the race options, we are seeing more persons that self-identify that way. Additionally, some other things that are of note, other than just demographics, we had about 56% of those accessing shelter self-report one or more disabling conditions. It should be noted that some people carried multiple disabling conditions that access shelter. Also, about 21% of shelter stayers self-reported having a history of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, stalking, or human trafficking, and 23% of those individuals reported that their most recent experience was within the past 3 months of presenting at shelter. Approximately 21% of shelter stayers reported that they were experiencing chronic homelessness, which would of course be at least 12 or more months in the past 3 years. and nearly 5% of shelter stayers identified as veterans. One of the things that I definitely wanted to highlight is that although this was funded as a solution for those that were experiencing homelessness that might have an inability to access other shelter, either due to a shelter not meeting their needs or serving the population they fell into, or through having a restriction to other shelters, we saw that this actually operated as a broader safety net for our community. We had a number of persons entering shelter that did not come from a literal homeless situation. Only about half of those entered from literal homelessness. We saw that 10% entered from institutional settings, the bulk of those coming from hospitals, jail, prison, psychiatric facilities or hospitals, and long-term substance abuse treatment facilities. We also had 14% coming from temporary settings, the majority of those being persons that were staying with friends or family on a temporary basis. In our office, we received notice of a few individuals who, for example, were staying with somebody, but with this shelter being available, if there was a disagreement, an altercation, they might have been asked to instead go to shelter. And finally, we even had some folks, about 5%, that entered from permanent housing. Some of those were folks that were coming from rentals that might have been evicted from housing. But we also had a number of individuals that owned their own unit. We also had some individuals that were renters that might have had some subpar living conditions and temporarily accessed the shelter while those conditions were being addressed. So just definitely wanted to highlight the broad scope of needs that this shelter met. Finally, in terms of some of the outcomes, any shelter provider knows that it's a real challenge to get good quality data around exit destination. Sometimes when people leave shelter, they do not communicate at all to inform us of where they're going to go upon exit. Sometimes we try to follow up and might not be able to obtain that information. But we have looked at the data and have been able to identify, both from HMIS and through direct provider knowledge, at least 49 positive exits. We had 7 persons that went to long-term institutional settings like nursing homes or assisted living or substance use treatment. We had 6 persons that went to transitional housing programs. That includes 1 individual that went to sober living. And then the bulk of those positive exits, 36 persons, went into a rental by client or potentially living with family permanent tenure. So we're definitely encouraged that we saw some positive exits. While this is a small subset of the overall 1,006 persons, the average person only stayed at the Hope Village for a nominal period, probably about a week at a time. So those that did stay with us longer term, we had better opportunities to work with, engage in services, and make movement towards permanent housing. Of course, that shelter was unable to meet the needs of everyone in our community, so we had some other resources that were included in our response. This included funding for Community Action Council to expand their emergency family housing program. That program typically uses apartment units as shelter. However, it can be difficult to obtain and place persons into an apartment unit on an emergency basis. So we provided some funding that allowed them to place individuals into hotel that had minor children over the winter season and provide supportive services towards permanent housing. That project served 20 households and 72 persons. They served a couple of very large families in that program. And the majority of those, 60%, exited to permanent housing. That would be 12 households. 4 of them moved into rentals that had ongoing subsidy, including 2 households that just moved into the new Pemberton units that were a partnership between LFUCG and the Lexington Housing Authority. We had 2 households that went into transitional housing or another form of shelter. For example, there was a unit that opened up with the emergency family housing program that one of those households was able to transition to. And then there were about 30% of households that went to some kind of temporary situation. Some of those went to move in with family. Others had transitioned to paying for hotel at their own expense, but continued to work with staff towards permanent housing. In terms of those that were living with family, we did have a couple of households that ultimately weren't satisfied with the hotels that they were placed in and chose to instead move in with family. And last but definitely not least, the Bluegrass Care Navigators program that was funded to serve those that were senior and disabled that were not appropriate for other shelters due to their needs. That program served 26 households and 31 persons. The majority of those that they served, 13 persons, 42%, moved into permanent housing, such as a rental by a client, but they also had several stories of families that reconnected and maybe accepted long-term placement of that individual back with family to help facilitate care and provide a more stable situation. We also had a number of folks who, after assessment, was identified that they needed longer-term care or needed to transition to a hospital. There was a number of folks who continued to remain in hotel at their own expense or that temporarily transitioned to living with family. And then we had a handful of persons that did exit to homeless situations. The kind of note here is that some of those individuals had conditions that were temporary, that after some time in this program were able to transition back to one of our existing shelters to open a space for another individual within this program at a kind of higher level of care. Unfortunately, we did have a few persons that we have in a kind of other category. There were 2 persons that unfortunately passed away during the season, so thankfully we were able to provide them with a shelter resource during that time, and 1 individual who did not complete an exit interview with staff. Because of the needs with this program, I wanted to also share a couple of specific examples of outcomes or stories from that program. Just looking at the outcomes data alone, I don't think it really paints the full picture of how hard that Bluegrass Care Navigators and all the community partners worked to serve these individuals. We had 1 participant who had come into the program after staying in a hotel. She had been evicted following a lengthy hospitalization and was no longer able to pay for a hotel on her own. She came into the program and they facilitated her getting into permanent housing with the Bob Brown House. They've since done a 4-month check-in, and she remains permanently housed and in good health. And she states that the Bob Brown House feels like a family. Another household had been participating in a continuum of care permanent supportive housing program, but temporarily returned to homelessness following eviction. Due to some of the challenges with their background, it was not quick and easy to rehouse that family, and due to the head of household being paraplegic with numerous medical issues, they had difficulty accessing other shelter. During their stay in the program, the head of household completed 2 planned medical procedures, obtained SSDI income, learned to use public transit, and the COC provider was able to get them back into permanent housing by the end of the season. There was also several instances of persons presenting at the Hope Village temporary shelter that truly weren't appropriate for that environment. We had some folks dropped off to us from facilities, sometimes even outside of the area. that really had needs that just could not be met in this environment. One such individual was recently diagnosed with cancer when he came to the Hope Village and then referred to Bluegrass Care Navigators. They assisted him in obtaining a Metaport, which allowed him to initiate his chemotherapy. And during his stay, he reconnected with his children and his ex-wife, who allowed him to move in with him on a permanent basis and are assisting with his care. Another individual with a history of cancer and a dependence on oxygen coordinated with numerous different providers during his stay and moved into permanent housing with St. James Place, and was being evaluated for enrollment in Bluegrass Care Navigators PACE program, which provides a high level of support to elderly individuals to make sure that they have supports to stay in the community rather than move into an institutional setting. So that is also connecting these two pieces of a budget update and a winter update. We have worked to process the final invoices for these programs, and at our last meeting, the board had voted to provide an additional $40,000 in funding to Community Action Council for their emergency family housing winter shelter services. And we actually were just shy of covering the full expenses. So in order for us to fully reimburse them for everything, the board would need to make an additional commitment of $1,500. So that would be an item that I would be seeking a motion for. TC's got me for a motion. Do we have a second? Kathy? All right. Is there any questions or discussion around that? All those in favor on the board? All opposed? All right, that motion passes. And I'm almost done talking. We are going to have our next meeting here in this room. I know we do have a couple of dates that are outliers, but next time we'll be here in the Phoenix Building, 3rd floor conference room at 1:30, and that's going to fall on Wednesday, July 10th. Go ahead, board members, and be prepared that around that time we'll probably have the COC NOFO, or Notice of Funding Opportunity drop, and we may potentially need to schedule some additional special meetings or pack some of our already scheduled meetings full of a lot of items for you to approve. So just in advance, I thank you for helping us get through all those needed approvals that are required by HUD. At this time, we'll open the floor for any public comment on issues not on the agenda.
I would actually like to go ahead and give an update. I know Charlie wants to kind of hear how things are going with our Hands Up for Housing that we're doing with Goodwill and the Fayette County Public Schools McKinney-Vento. My phone is ringing off the hook on it, although it goes back to the school. So I can say that we've been able to now identify more of our families, our students that are McKinney-Vento, so our increase of identifying, that's helped us to do that. As to date, I've probably done about 12, 13 referrals to the Goodwill, and so far, so good with that. We've had several of them that are sitting on my desk waiting for additional information. Part of that, and let me explain to some of y'all that don't know about that, through the commissioner's office, they donated $400,000, $150,000 for this fiscal year, and then $250,000 for next fiscal year. And it is a collaboration with Fayette County Public Schools McKinney-Vento program, which is our students and families that are homeless. And so we've worked with Goodwill to set up a program because we looked at what is going to help our families with sustainability. That's the main piece right there. And so we looked at it, and so Goodwill, one of their requirements is that they must have some type of income for us to even get them started. And so those persons that have those incomes, they have to verify that. And so when it comes to me, we look over it, make sure all the information is correct, and then we send it, forward it to Goodwill. And from there, they will schedule orientation, they will assign them a career coach, and they will do a complete assessment of their needs. And so from there, they're able to kind of navigate that family to needs. And I'm expressing to my families, this is not a one-stop shop. This is not a handout, but you're gonna have to kind of work with us. You're gonna have to work the plan in order for you to be able to sustain housing, because that's the whole goal. Because in looking at some of my data, I'm finding out that I have so many students that are chronically homeless year after year after year. And so our goal is to try to help those students and their families sustain housing, because that's going to help our students when looking at behavior, when looking at absentees, when looking at grades, and looking at our students, and they're not on grade level, so they're behind. So how do we try to help our students in the educational system be more productive academically? So that is a big key to that. And so I've had several calls. Goodwill's had several calls of people that are not McKinney-Vento that's kind of trying to go around the program. And so we're trying to, you need to tap into your community resources for that type of support. The need to be able to offer more community resources, that's kind of where we're at. We just kind of like, we all know that all of that is decreasing tremendously in our community. And so for us, one of the things that I'm not looking forward to is I've already been contacted by KDE that my upcoming expiration date for providing temporary shelter at hotels is going to end in September. And so with us only having the Salvation Army, and if they are a Greenhouse 17 candidate, that those shelters are already full to the max. So I'm over the summer like, okay, so what is it that we need to put in place, because it's still a growing situation in our community. And so just any kind of ideas that they have. I'm currently in the process of organizing what it's called Project Elevate Summer Academy. It's a summer camp that we offer to our homeless students. I sent a proposal last year to be able to employ our high school McKinney-Vento students to be youth counselors. So we have 10 slated on our list to put through training. So they'll get CPR and first aid certification. They'll get the food handler's permit, and then they'll get a training on how to help leadership in summer camp. We will be offering summer camp to 60 of our students from 3rd grade to 8th grade. So we'll have a middle school and an elementary component to that. And so we are working on that. That'll be 3 weeks in June. We have a week of training, and then we have 2 weeks of camp for those students. Also, like one of the things that I do on the last day of camp, and I'm going to put this out there, any community partners, that last year it was very successful. We asked for the families, our parents, to actually come to camp, because we called it Camp Celebration. And so we set up a community expo so that those families could tap into community resources right then and there, so that they're able to, we're trying to empower them to take the reins and do it for themselves. So in order to do that, then we're gonna set up an expo for them to get that. This year, it's gonna be on June the 21st, 12 to 2, and it's gonna be actually at the John G. Price Building. We're gonna use the big conference room. And so the kids are gonna actually, they're doing music therapy as one of their classes, so they're gonna actually do a performance at camp, so that ought to be awesome. And so we're gonna do that, and so that's one of the things that we're gonna do for Community Table Talk, is to solicit our community partners to volunteer for that.
Thank you. Lots of good updates and information, and nice to have a break and me talking. Other announcements or public sharing from the members? July 15th.
You referenced that, Jeff, and talked about getting somewhat voiced. What are people talking about? Like a fund that pays penalties or?
So right now, I'm still waiting on some final guidance from our law department to understand exactly what this means for our standard operating procedures for addressing encampments, for example. So with that respect, I have to kind of wait until I have the final word for them before I can finalize my plans. But some things that we are looking at is that we are likely going to have a need for a few things. One would be, for example, if somebody is arrested as a result of this new law, a strategy to make sure that we can try to protect individuals from losing their personal belongings and knowing that the jail is probably not going to be equipped to adequately handle all of the level of belongings that they might see. We are anticipating that we are likely going to have the need for some additional resources for things like shelter or temporary accommodations if that person, for example, cannot access one of our other shelters. It could potentially be an expansion of street outreach services or funding of additional case management. I'm also looking at, we had used some of our donated funds to the Lexington Homelessness Fund to do some financial assistance, and we had housed that in a broader discussion of potentially developing something like a flex fund that could be used to cover costs that typically can't be covered by grant funds. So I'm using this opportunity to flesh out kind of a process for a potential flex fund that if we have folks that can be moved into permanent housing with a relatively minimal investment, if it's a deposit, if it's funds to cover obtaining a birth certificate, if there's some kind of costs that we can use our local funds for in partnership with those other resources, making sure that people don't have to wait for a program to open up from coordinated entry, something that might take a significant amount of time that can't be executed when we're trying to very timely respond to someone's situation.
Could funding be used for payment of fines?
Of payment of fines, I would. Yeah. And
What about, so when is the Supreme Court decision? That would supersede?
That'll be late this summer.
yeah, it's expected that it's going to be several months before we'll have a decision in the Grants Pass, Oregon case. Right now, no one knows definitively how that's going to be, but for example, it could end up being that it's bounced back to being a state decision, in which case we would know exactly what our situation would be. So I'm just going ahead and on my end, I'm assuming that's the reality that I'm facing and that my office is going to have to deal with. And so I'm trying to figure out exactly what I can build with all of our resources that's going to be the most effective. There's still going to be some questions about what this means in practice that we just won't be able to answer. So I also need to leave some flexibility for us to be able to adapt and modify those resources so that if we find that something's not working, that we can quickly adjust.
Can a private citizen pay a fine?
That would still be something I would be a little bit unsure of since there is that third-party bail payment restriction. I would have to bounce that to the legal team.
Okay. I also wanna actually also comment on that too. I already have calls that's coming in. Families are like panicking. I had one family literally withdrew their kids from school because they're afraid that their children are going to be taken away from them. One of the things that I do know that is still on almost a weekly or every other week base, I have a family that's living in a car. And so, I mean, that I get a lot of questions about how is that going to affect our families and children. DBCS, they are overloaded. So, I mean, so if a parent is arrested, so that's another traumatizing our children. And then if a parent is also arrested, then what happens to their children? So, I mean, that's huge. I mean, I don't think that was even a thought. When people think of homelessness, they don't think of children and youth as part of that. I mean, that is a reality, and we do have even a number of unaccompanied youth that are on our streets that are homeless. And so the question is, how's that gonna look?
And the sad thing is, I think folks would say, well, it's probably not best for kids to be living in a car, but they don't know the reality of the systems of how that's going to impact the kid and really where are they going to go. It's not like we're opting to live in the car. It's we have no other place to go. Our communities are full, our shelters are full, our home might not be safe because of domestic violence or, yeah, it's a little maddening. Have we heard from law enforcement at all? Like, do we have an idea how proactively they're going to be looking into this? Or are they still in that, are they in the same place as us of like trying to figure it all out?
I would have to defer to police to actually speak to that. At this time, I know that generally speaking, they try to be compassionate with our population. I don't think they have a desire to enforce and are obviously kind of in a tricky position of there's also language about us prohibiting enforcement. So that's still being navigated, but I know that they do not want to see people criminalized just for lacking a place to live. And they're probably, like me, are waiting for some further guidance from law, both in respect to things like our encampment SOPs, but also things like our parks SOPs. And TC, I would like to sometime follow up with you and just know a little bit more about the calls that you're receiving so I can consider that as I'm working through this process.
I had a question for TC. Do you have to be a legal resident to be eligible for McKinney-Vento? It's been a long time since do you have to be here legally?
Have a student in the Fayette County Public Schools,
But the family doesn't,
and you have to be,
okay.
a lot of times we'll get that are convicted, according to the federal law, however, we do further that coordinators so that connected with community.
And when you were thinking about housing for the summer for the families, I know some of the larger churches have owned buildings that they put people in temporarily. I know I live near one large church and I know they own 2 buildings that are apartment buildings that they put different groups in. And I imagine even larger churches do as well. I wonder if Build or any of the church communities, if they were approached by the public schools, would be willing for the summer to.
I don't think that'll be something fall under our umbrella, but I do for the cabin. Or maybe even Marty.
Oh, right, and you need permanent, yeah, okay,
Because that could be considered transitional housing.
okay.
So that could give them a. So it would not fall under 73 schools.
Yeah, right.
And on the subject of House Bill 5, I would just make sure that everyone's aware of the 2 minor wins that we had within that process. One being that they did remove restrictions on use of federal funds towards programming that was operating on a housing first model. So there's no concern about being able to continue to use COC or other federal funds to operate housing first programs, but also there was modification around the inclusion of cars in that definition of camping. I believe under the final draft, there's a time limit on how long someone can be in 12 hours in one fixed location sleeping in their vehicle, but so long as they were to move that vehicle, it would no longer fall under that definition. So I know that's going to be tricky to try to explain to people who are concerned, like the calls that you're receiving, but it's not going to be as black and white as an immediate someone found sleeping in their vehicle is automatically going to face these charges.
Sorry for talking all the time, but I also know, I think the police, if they knew of options, they would definitely take the people there or refer them there as a first response, because they did that for the winter shelter, they were happy to bring them there. And this is kind of outside the box, but what if we were able to identify neutral spaces for people that were in their cars, not to encourage them to be in their cars, but like, we all know of one place you can park your car and nobody's gonna complain. What if there were more than one?
So the idea of like a safe parking space is something that had recently, come up in conversations, and my office is looking at data to better understand the number of persons that we have that are residing in vehicles, and if that would be something that would be an effective solution for our community. And, back to your point in regards to police, they generally do operate with officer discretion, and they try to see if there is a better way to handle a particular situation. So I believe that they do plan to try to, when possible, connect someone with resources rather than arrest. But obviously, there may be limitations on them directly transporting individuals due to things like liability. So, in kind of the exploration that I'm looking at for different resources, what would be that mechanism that would be able to respond in the moment, and help someone move to another location, get to a safer environment?
Like street outreach?
It could be expanding street outreach. It could be adding resources to work in combination with street outreach. But, if we're faced with those situations where someone would otherwise be at risk of being arrested, how can we potentially divert that?
And while you're talking about staff, when you talked about the intensive case management, that the RFP that hasn't been filled, do you think that person could be positioned at the winter shelter for this coming year? Just because I think we could get much better data if we had someone dedicated, well, plus case management, but.
So I would probably be hesitant to do that just because of I don't want to veer too far away from the actual aim of that program, but I am definitely more than happy to have the conversation around looking at trying to increase what we were able to facilitate at the temporary shelter. I don't think everyone understands that in all the different costs that we had, you were not able to also, as the Hope Center, offer a lot of additional staff supports for things like data collection and data entry, or a lot of other ongoing services that you were basically operating just the shelter component, and that we had to rely on partners as a system to deliver a lot of the other services to help move persons forward. So that's definitely, as we look forward to our solution, to developing it further, definitely would like to see if there's an option to add additional supports that can increase not only the data that we get, but positive outcomes as well. You guys did a tremendous job with the level of staffing that you had available to you. We definitely appreciate that, and I would definitely welcome David, yourself, as we move into those planning meetings, to put that on the table and make sure that's something that we're considering.
All right, I'm gonna say this last comment and I'm gonna be quiet. Okay, it's a comment. Just when we started to build our trust and our community relationships with our police department, now our children are gonna look at them and think, are you gonna arrest me because I'm homeless? That's, oh, I'm sorry. It's on. Yeah, what I was saying is, I said it's sad that our police department had started building community relationships within the communities. And so now with this new law, how are our children, one, going to look at law enforcement, not as a community partner, but now is it someone that's coming to arrest me because I'm homeless? So that, I know that's going to be a weight.
So on that uplifting note, are there other announcements or public sharing before we would adjourn?
Sorry, last one, because we're not going to be here again for a while. We were talking about the things that go into effect in July. I know there's going to be certification for sober living homes there. It's going to go into effect in July. I've been waiting for that for a long time, and I don't know if there are any substance abuse programs or anything in here, but I wonder how that's going to look. I know we try not to refer to particular sober living homes right now because some are great, but lots and lots of them take advantage. And I was wondering if you or anyone knows what that looks like when when the certification starts, when the list goes out, who's certified, and how, do you know of any of that?
So I'm by far not an expert. We are definitely talking with our law team about what that kind of means in practice. But our substance use disorder intervention program does have a meeting scheduled. I believe I have that information here. Looks like May 21st, there is a meeting occurring at 6 p.m. at the Alano Club. And that's going to be a meeting regarding those new regulations and hopefully giving some better information as to what that means in terms of what those facilities are required to do and how it's going to kind of impact current operators.
I'll probably go to that. I forgot to tell you the reason I ask is lots of guys in the past year end up dropped off at the Hope Center and homeless because they came to Lexington for a sober living facility and they're kicked out for whatever reason, and then they're from Eastern Kentucky or even, I mean, pretty far away, and they have no way of getting home, and then they're at the Hope Center or they're even at the winter shelter.
We've heard that there should be some potentially provisions that might facilitate that transportation, but we're just trying to confirm that with law. So hopefully that's something that we'll be able to share officially soon.
I would be interested in hearing about that as well, because we get kids all the time from sober living from other counties.
Yeah, we'll definitely make sure that we get that to the whole group, and we'll present it, here in future meetings as well. But if there's anything timely can get you in an email or something, I'll make sure I get it to you. Any other announcements or public sharing?
Well, I have an announcement about, just public sharing. For those who don't know, Recovery Cafe Lexington is now open 7 days a week, so that's people can access food, recovery support. Our definition of recovery includes homelessness and other traumas, so it's not just about substance use disorder. Starting June 1st, we'll be open Monday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 7 p.m., and on Sundays, we're going to have a shorter day, 12 to 4. We are open on Mondays right now, but it's a 4-hour day also. It's on Versailles Road, close to Nathaniel Mission.
Thank you, Aaron. I know I've been awaiting that announcement for some time, so glad to hear it's coming to fruition. I think I've got it right, but email me that information about the times so that I can make sure that we update resource cards and help you share that announcement. Last call for public sharing. All right, do we have a motion to adjourn? All right, thank you.
Yeah.
If you did not sign in, please do so. Thank you.